Greetings and welcome to Philosophy. Today we're going to talk about some background information on what is philosophy and how to approach the topic of philosophy and some of the major figures in philosophy, just general background kind of information. Here you see some of the characteristics of philosophical thought, as well as some issues with these characteristics. On the one hand, philosophers are characterized by curiosity and wonder. Of course, this is also true of artists, of scientists, and others, but philosophy really has its source, as we will see in some of the quotes to follow, really has its source in an openness to reality, as well as a desire for truth, which we'll talk about later as well. But this immediately brings up the issue, isn't this kind of childish? After all, asking questions like what is the meaning of life may not have practical results, and if they don't have practical results, isn't it childish to be a philosopher? This is an accusation that has been made of philosophers since at least the time of Socrates. We see Socrates, for example, in the first book of the Republic, talking to Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a sophist, and he's a lawyer, and he's a very serious-minded person. And he finally gets frustrated with Socrates' endless questioning and gets up in a huff and insults Socrates and says, Socrates, to paraphrase, you sit around chattering like an old woman. Why don't you get up, get out, pull up your socks and wipe your sniveling nose and get out and get a real job like a real man? And Thrasymachus stomps off. This has been more or less the attitude of the grown-up, quote-unquote grown-up or serious-minded folks for many, many centuries. On the other hand, philosophy can be very practical in that it involves skepticism, doubt, criticism, analysis. The idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates' quote to that effect. Why would the unexamined life not be worth living? I think after a week spent looking at Plato's cave allegory, or the Matrix, makes it very clear why the unexamined life is not worth living. Essentially, you're a prisoner in a cave of your own presuppositions, and nobody wants to do that. The idea of second innocence here is a different take on this idea of childishness. This is a phrase that comes from the British Romantic poet William Wordsworth. He says that we're all born innocent. We're all born with curiosity and wonder and awe at reality, at the world, at life. But that society beats that innocence out of us, makes us grow up, makes us get serious and find jobs and find our identity and all this kind of stuff. And for most people, that initial innocence is just more or less wiped out. But that there are those who retain that innocence even into adulthood, and these are the artists, the poets, and I would say the philosophers as well. In this case, second innocence is a virtue. It is the openness to reality that makes things like art possible. At the same time, there is a grown-up aspect, if you will, to philosophy, and that is that we insist on rigor, strictness of thinking. We have methods, logical methods, and methods of reasoning and analysis. Hermeneutical methods, hermeneutical, H-E-R-M-E-N-E-U-T-I-C, hermeneutic. That has to do with interpretation, and there are techniques and ways of going about analysis and interpretation. And we need to learn these techniques so that we can reason more clearly and better. And we'll talk more about why reasoning in a strict and organized way is important in a little bit. Here's a couple quotes from Socrates on curiosity and wonder. The first one is, the translation's not entirely clear, but what it means is that philosophers are enamored, that is, they are in love with the truth and how the truth shows up, and that is reality. To know the truth is to know reality, and philosophers are in love with finding the truth of reality. This sense of wonder has no other, philosophy has no other source than this sense of wonder, Socrates says. Modern 20th century philosopher and Nazi, Martin Heidegger. Yes, I did say he's a Nazi, but we have to admit that up front when we're talking about Heidegger, who is, on the other hand, one of the great philosophers and most influential philosophers of the 20th century. So we have to reconcile that he was both of those things somehow. Anyway, he puts it a slightly different way. He says, why are there beings at all instead of nothing? And he says, he's not asking, where did everything come from? He's not asking, about the Big Bang Theory or something. He's not asking about creation. Did God create anything? What he's actually asking is about us. He's asking about human beings. He's asking, why is it that human beings are made in such a way that they have the kind of consciousness that they do? That reality shows up to them as meaningful, and that they can take these meanings, they can combine these meanings and interpret and analyze all of these meanings just like the prisoners in the bottom of the cave do. They take all the images that come in through their senses, the sensory appearances that show up on the wall of the cave as shadows, and they interpret them and analyze them and combine them and put them into categories. And in fact, the images on the wall of the cave include all of human knowledge. All of human knowledge is the images on the wall of the cave. And Heidegger says, why are we that kind of being? That's essentially the same question that metaphysics, the study of reality itself, or the study of the broadest possible concepts, metaphysics, that's what metaphysics studies and has since the beginning. Skepticism and doubt. Here we get into Socratic method. Socrates did not write anything. The main part of what we know about Socrates comes from his student Plato. Plato spent 30, 40 years writing dialogues that featured Socrates and showed Socrates doing philosophy the way he did. Socrates' manner of doing philosophy is called dialectic because it is based on dialogue. Socrates, generally speaking, liked to get hold of somebody who thought they knew something, a sophist, one of these lawyers or politicians, or somebody who thought they knew something and who had a reputation for knowing it, who actually did, have the reputation at least of knowing something, like the nature of justice, for example. And so we see in the first book of the Republic, Socrates talking with Thrasymachus and trying to get a definition of justice. And then what Socrates generally would do is, the first thing he would do is he would take a position of not knowing what the thing was that they were searching for. So if it was justice, Socrates would say he didn't know what justice is. I don't know what justice is. I've always been very confused. I'm so glad, Thrasymachus, I have a chance to talk to you and hear an expert's opinion, because I hear so many different opinions and I really don't know what to think. So Socrates would take that ironic stance of ignorance. And it's ironic because, of course, Socrates isn't completely ignorant. After all, if he was completely ignorant, he wouldn't even know what questions to ask. And Socrates is very careful in the questions he asks. So he's not completely ignorant. But what he does by claiming ignorance is he gets his opponent to open up. He makes his opponent, or his interlocutor, the person he's talking to, he makes them feel better about themselves and like their opinion really matters. And so we see Thrasymachus feeling very good and very proud and coming up with a definition. Justice is the will of the stronger, he says. And then Socrates, continuing to act ignorant, acts impressed. Wow, that's amazing. That's a great definition. And then he starts to ask questions. He'll say something like, there's just one or two things that confuse me about your definition. Do you mind if I ask questions? At this point, his interlocutor, in this case Thrasymachus, typically groans and gives a big eye roll because he knows what's coming, that Socrates is going to start hammering away at that definition. And that's what Socrates does. Socrates asks questions that lead Thrasymachus, or whoever Socrates is talking to, that leads that person to the point where the definition is shown to be faulty in some way. It's self-contradictory. It doesn't meet with normal experience, or it has other flaws. At that point, Thrasymachus starts to get a little steamed. He thought he knew what justice was. He has a reputation for knowing what it was, and now Socrates has embarrassed him in front of his friends. So Socrates generally will say, no, no, it's no problem. Let's just revise the definition, start again. And they will do that until the second definition falls apart. And after this happens 2 or 3 times, that the person's definition of something that they thought they were an expert on has fallen apart, generally they either stomp off in a huff or they maybe realize their own ignorance. This is called the moment of aporia, A-P-O-R-I-A. And it's a moment of opportunity, if the person will take it, to realize their own ignorance, to achieve learned ignorance. That is, if we're going, as Socrates says in the Meno, the dialogue Meno, M-E-N-O, in that dialogue he's talking to Meno, and they're talking about excellence. The Greek word is arete, A-R-E-T-E, though you don't need to know that. Anyway, in that dialogue, Meno, after the definition falls apart yet again, Meno, just says in exasperation, Socrates, how are we going to go about this, finding out what excellence is? And Socrates says, Meno, do you realize what a problem you're conjuring up here? If you think about it, if we don't know what a thing is, we can't learn about it because we don't have any idea what it is. On the other hand, if we already think we know what something is, we don't learn about it because we already think we know what it is. So if we can't learn about something when we don't know what it is, and we can't learn about something when we already know what it is, how can we ever start learning? Socrates concludes, we have to know that we don't know. And that's really what Socratic dialectic is intended to produce. The aporia, the state in which a person realizes their own ignorance for the first time. Won't go over this quote from Descartes too much, since we'll be dealing with it a little bit later, but Cartesian skepticism or Cartesian doubt is one form of systematic doubt that exists in philosophy. Dialectic would be another. Descartes concludes that he really has no solid foundation for all the things that he has been taught, and he wants a solid foundation for science. He's very similar to Plato in that regard, trying to find a foundation, a solid foundation for the knowledge of science. And he thinks that the only way he's going to get this is if he challenges all of the things he's previously been taught in order to find one idea that is absolutely certain on which he can build all the rest of his ideas like a great, perfectly built building. And we'll see how he does that later in the semester. Now, in addition to these characteristics of philosophy, these can sound kind of otherworldly and impractical, as we've already said. There are directly practical reasons for studying philosophy. Interestingly, your textbook, which I call here, by the way, Honer and Hunt, that's your that's your invitation to philosophy textbook. They don't mention wonder as practical, and I just would like to suggest that, of course, as impractical or, ivory tower, pie in the sky, abstract, etc., as philosophers can be, wonder itself is an incredibly practical thing. I mean, a person doesn't even get out of bed in the morning if they don't wonder. If they don't have what Heidegger called the care structure, if we weren't hooked up to care about the world in the way that we are. And so I think wonder is eminently practical, but at the same time, there are other practical applications of philosophy. The biggest one, the most important one overall, I would have to say, is critical thinking. If you get nothing else from a philosophy class, you should get an improved ability in critical thinking, knowing some of the methods of critical thinking, being able to organize your own thoughts in more logical ways, and that kind of thing. Now, when we're doing critical thinking, what we're doing is examining and analyzing and evaluating our own ideas. And this points to the fact that most of us, most of the time, our brains are producing ideas without our consent. and ideas come into our mind, or a song gets stuck in our head, or a distraction comes, and our minds just follow it. So this raises the question of who runs your mind. Are you in charge of your brain, or is your brain in charge of you? In Hinduism, they call this monkey mind, that our thoughts tend to be like monkeys jumping around and chattering in the tops of trees and don't really say anything important, but they're just chattering all the time. So one of the things that should come out of any philosophy class is an increased ability to control your own thoughts, to analyze your own thoughts, to systematize your own thoughts. And in addition to other things, this is humanizing. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just 1 second. But this is based on the ability of self-critique and to see things from another person's perspective. Definitely a rare virtue anymore, and probably one of the hardest things to develop, a real appreciation of ideas different from one's own, even ideas one rejects. We'll talk more about that in a minute as well. So here's Bertrand Russell. In philosophy today, there are two major types of philosophy and philosophers. On the one hand, there are philosophers that do what is called continental philosophy. Continental philosophy, of course, refers to the continent of Europe, and therefore generally refers to the Western tradition of European philosophy that starts in ancient Greece in about 800 or 700 BCE, and continues down to today, of course, in things like existentialism and postmodernism. The other type of philosophy and philosopher is analytic. Analytic philosophy really begins right around in fact, Bertrand Russell would be one of the founding fathers of analytic philosophy. And obviously, you can tell by the name that it focuses more specifically on analysis, especially language analysis and logic. Now, that type of philosophy, generally speaking, is focused on the quality of the reasoning rather than the quality of the reasoner. That is, the person doing the philosophizing is not necessarily the object of doing the philosophy, but the object of doing the philosophy is to work out concepts, to work out analyses. So analytic philosophy tends to be relatively impersonal, along the lines of ideas of scientific objectivity. We want to be objective and impersonal in terms of our thinking, so that we don't have any biases or stereotypes or other kinds of bad reasoning. So, on the other hand, continental philosophy focuses very much on the development of subjectivity, the development of personhood, and so it's interesting here that Bertrand Russell, one of the fathers of analytic philosophy, is talking like a continental philosopher. Of course, these two traditions are never completely separate, but here he sounds flat out like a continental philosopher, saying essentially what Plato says in his cave allegory, that if you have not studied in any philosophy, and I think we could also safely say art, literature, and science and other things, but especially if you haven't studied philosophy, you are basically enchained by your own prejudices about by the opinions and beliefs that you've grown up with without actually consciously accepting them. But as soon as we start to analyze them philosophically, we find that even everyday types of things are actually not as clear and certain as we might think they are. And so while, on the one hand, philosophical reason leads to more uncertainty rather than to more certainty, on the other hand, as he says very nicely here, philosophy is able to suggest many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of reason. Very nicely said, and I think very much in agreement with Plato and the continental tradition. Let's talk about some conditions for doing philosophy. We'll go through each one of these individually. Tolerance, selflessness, self-discipline, clarity of thought, philosophical lingo, like any discipline, anything you're going to study in college. There's some specialized language in philosophy. We'll talk about what that might be. Aristotle says leisure is necessary for philosophy. I won't deal with that except to say that I always thought he meant that we had to have time on our hands. We had to be, have free time in order to do philosophy. The individual philosopher had to have free time. But actually what Aristotle is saying is that philosophy does not arise in culture, does not arise in society until the society has achieved a level of stability and peace so that there is a leisure class of a sort, a group of people who have the wealth and education to sit around and talk philosophy. And he's probably right about that. There's also some risks involved in doing philosophy, among which are anxiety, disillusionment, despair. Those are very real risks, and we'll take them seriously. And then at the end of this PowerPoint, you will find a couple of helpful things from your textbook that will help you to categorize the three major areas of philosophy, as well as to read your textbook itself, a thing called the continuum I'll explain at the end. So tolerance. So notice that on the slide having to do with tolerance, I immediately bring up argumentation. To argue with somebody usually it means that you're being intolerant, right? Well, in philosophy, the way that we express tolerance is through argumentation. Philosophical argumentation is not a shouting match. It's not a screaming match. Philosophical argumentation is nonviolent. It is non-abusive. Abuse is actually a low form of intellectual endeavor, and we're trying to here deal with arguments objectively and dispassionately, and that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, I have posted in the required viewing folder on D2L the video, The Argument Clinic from Monty Python. I hope you'll watch this, and it is funny, of course, but at the same time, we have here a good definition of the difference between contradiction and argumentation. And so I want you to make sure to write down what they say when they define argument, philosophical argument on the one hand, and contradiction on the other hand. Really, more than tolerance, tolerance simply means putting up with other people's ideas. In order to really do philosophy in the Socratic way, we need to achieve a state of selflessness like Socrates did. Selflessness is a quality that seems ideal, it seems unreal, but I think we're all familiar when we meet somebody who is selfless, or we see somebody act selflessly, that what the Buddha says here is absolutely true, that affects other people in a positive way, even people who aren't directly in the situation, who maybe just observe what has happened. That selfless act sort of pays itself forward, if you will. And I think that is really the ideal of philosophical engagement, is that there will be this development of our relationships and of our situation. But that's going to require some self-discipline. Now, the fact is, if you're listening to this, you're already an ascetic. Notice the spelling of this. There's another word, aesthetic, which sounds somewhat similar but spelled very differently, means something very different. Aesthetic, the second word, A-E-S-T-H-E-T-I-C, has nowadays mostly to do with art theory, but really goes back to a Greek word that has to do with the senses, aesthesis. Asceticism, the word we have here on the slide, comes from a Greek word that means discipline, specifically physical disciplines that are done for a spiritual purpose. And asceticism, well, it means more than just self-control, though. It really means the denial of sensory gratification now for the sake of a higher good, or a more spiritual good or intellectual good later. And of course, that's what you're doing when you're being a student. Is you could be out enjoying the sunshine, you could be at a movie, you could be doing something probably more enjoyable than this, but you are foregoing those activities. You're foregoing present pleasures, for the sake of a higher good, that is passing this class or getting a degree or maybe learning philosophy. So whatever your goal is, you are an ascetic in regard to making sacrifices to achieve that goal. So there's two main types of philosophical lingo, and I'm not going to test you on these, except the difference. So first off, there are terms that are thematized. In other words, they are made into a philosophical theme. Some of these words can be kind of odd. Some of them are just normal everyday words, but they're words that are around, and then they're taken and made into philosophical concepts by philosophers. Aristotle, for example, uses the phrase "to de ti," which is just, again, in Greek, it's kind of a weird phrase, but it just means this, that. He was trying to get his students to give him a definition of substance. What is, how do we know if something is a substance or not? And I can imagine him sort of pounding the podium and saying, in exasperation, when his students are giving him all of these abstract definitions, he finally just pounds the podium and says, no, a substance is a to de ti, a this, that. If you can hit it like that, it's a substance. Well, that becomes a technical word in philosophy. Kierkegaard's thematization of anxiety or angst, or he was writing in Danish, it's angst in Danish. Anxiety was an idea that was around, but he took it and made a philosophical theme of it, and I'll tell you more about that later in the semester. Heidegger's idea, Dasein, or being there, or there being. Well, da just means there, and sein means being in German. He just used those two words, and he turned it into a philosophical theme that has to do with the being of our being. In other words, our nature. Why are we the way we are? He wants to signify that by Dasein. So those are, again, you just take normal words and you turn them to philosophical use. That's a thematized concept. On the other hand, you can make words up. Neologisms. Now, neologisms mostly are what Humpty Dumpty calls portmanteau words. Portmanteau word in Alice in Wonderland is a word that is made up of two other words, like in Jabberwocky, 'twas brillig and the slithy toves. Slithy comes from slippery and slimy, so or slithery and slimy. So that is a portmanteau word, and most neologisms fall into that category. Like hospitality is hostility and hospitality put together. Derrida's paradoxical notion that all forms of hospitality actually sort of hide a little bit of hostility. His word difference is a little bit different, as it should be. This is not either a French or English spelling of difference. It's a deliberate misspelling. Now, in French, it would still be pronounced différence. In English, it would be pronounced difference, because you don't pronounce it differently, it just looks differently. And he's making a comment through deliberately misspelling, but not mispronouncing this word. He's making a comment on the relationship of written words and the sound of words. We won't go into that more here. Lyotard has a similar phrase, the differend, a very helpful concept I'll probably introduce you to later in the semester. And then there's, I guess, some technical terminology. An awful lot of these come out of the Middle Ages when they invented a lot of technical terminology. Things like substance, essence. Aseity is a great word. It means something that exists from itself. And of course, if there is any such thing, something that exists completely independently of all other things, it doesn't depend on anything else. The only concept or the only thing that has that definition would be God. That is, again, in the Middle Ages, the dominant form of philosophy was Roman Catholic theology. And so aseity was a concept that came out of medieval philosophy. Kant's antinomies, which just means opposing laws. These are philosophical lingo, and you really kind of learn these as you go. And of course, I'll introduce you to many of these words, like the word philosophy itself, and we'll break them down into their root meanings and try to get at what they mean and their complexities. There are rules to how words are used, and therefore we can maybe incorporate Wittgenstein's idea of a language game here. Philosophy, or really each type of philosophy, is its own language game with its own rules, and we have to regard how the words are used within the rules of the given game that we're playing. You know, puns are a great example of this, because a pun is a word that has two different meanings, and when you play on one of those meanings, you're taking the idea out of its normal context or its actual context, and that's, you know, amusing. When we are studying philosophical concepts, we have to put terms within the game they came from and try to understand the rules that determine the meaning of those words in their actual context. I've already mentioned leisure, but again, I think this has more to do with society developing a condition in which you can have an educated elite. Keep in mind that for almost all of human history, the educated elite was a minuscule fraction of the total population of any society, and that the intellectuals were also the economic elite. That is, to get a higher education, you had to be in the upper classes and had to be able to pay for it. And I think this is a very significant thing to realize, in particular when studying things like Aristotle. He comes from an elite, and that influences his philosophy. Or study utilitarianism in the 19th century in Britain. You know, there are social factors that contribute to the development of philosophical movements and ideas, and we need to understand what those forces are as well. Ultimately, there is a risk with doing philosophy, and that is that the truth might not be limited to what we would like it to be limited to. Here, Nietzsche very beautifully states this case that very often, if we're going to really pursue the truth, we may be going into areas that make us uncomfortable, that cause cognitive dissonance, that cause, you know, can even go beyond skepticism. The term skepticism comes from an ancient Greek school, the skeptics, and skepticism basically means a doubt about the nature of the truth. Usually the skeptic will believe there might be truth, but even if there is truth, it's very hard to find, and most people are too lazy, stupid, or distracted to try to find it. That's the skeptical position, and almost all philosophers have been skeptics. But you know, the risk is that when we start looking for truth and we don't find it right away, that we can become cynical. And the Cynics were another Greek philosophical school. The Cynic position is that there is no truth, and that most humans are too stupid, lazy, or distracted to try to find it. So I think this is what Nietzsche's getting at, is that there is this danger of cynicism or nihilism, of just denying that there is any truth at all. And so we have to be careful, hopefully not to go too far with our reasoning to the point of, you know, cynically dismissing the truth. This is a quote from the American philosopher Jacob Needleman. I recommend you look up his website. I think it might just be jacobneedleman.com. He taught philosophy at San Francisco State University for, I don't know, 50 years or so. He's retired now, but he's still very active, writing all kinds of books. Very good stuff, very interesting guy. And he says here that the function of philosophy is to help us remember. So this raises the question, what is it that we have forgotten? What have we forgotten if we needed to be reminded? And what kind of reminders would these be that aren't pleasant? What is it that we've forgotten? Is it maybe the truth itself, or is it maybe our duty to others, or what exactly is it that we can be said to have forgotten? Plato gives us a possible answer to this. This is, now, one of the things Plato does is sometimes when he's asked a direct question, he'll give an indirect answer by way of a myth, for example, a story. Rather than giving a concept, he'll give a story. And in this case, this is called the myth of anamnesis. First, a word on myth. A myth is an explanatory story. A myth is not a fiction. That doesn't mean that myths are literally true. They may or may not be literally true, or aspects of them may or may not be literally true. But a myth is a story that explains the nature of things in some way. And so that's what Plato is going to give us. Is a myth. I don't think for one second that Plato actually believed this is the way things are. Well, maybe he did. There are belief systems like this, religions that have beliefs like what Plato presents here. But whether or not things literally happen this way is not the important part of this myth of anamnesis. Now, anamnesis, that's a complicated Greek word, but it's not that complicated. An on the beginning of the word basically means the same as the prefix un in English, un. Amnesis is where we get the word amnesia, which of course means forgetting. So anamnesis, A-N-A-M-N-E-S-I-S, means an unforgetting, a remembering. So the myth of anamnesis is this. Plato says that prior to our individual birth, our spirit already existed. Now, spirit has certain characteristics, and you might want to write these down. We'll be talking about them a little bit, well, a lot throughout the remainder of the semester. But spirit has certain qualities. The qualities of spirit are that it's a unity. It doesn't have parts. It doesn't move. Or if that doesn't sound good, you could say that it is omnipresent. Spirit is everywhere, so therefore it doesn't have to move. It is unchangeable, immutable, I-M-M-U-T-A-B-L-E, immutable, unchanging. Spirit is omniscient, omniscient, O-M-N-I on the beginning word means all. The S-C-I-E-N-T on the back half of this word is where we get the word science. So this is all-knowing is what omniscient means. Now, if spirit is like that, first thing is, if our spirit existed without a body prior to our birth, then our spirit and all spirits were unified in one great big spirit field or spirit being. At any rate, at that point, your spirit knew everything because it was in contact with everything else. Keep in mind, spirit has no parts and it's everywhere. And it's omniscient. So when your spirit existed prior to being put in your body, it knew everything. But then your spirit got stuck into your body, and that was called your birth. And when you were born, because the nature of the body is the opposite of the nature of the spirit. The spirit is perfect in all the ways I just said. But the body has parts, it moves, it changes, and it's ignorant. So when the spirit gets put into the body, it forgets everything it knew, which is why babies are stupid. Okay, hold on. Maybe that's not the right word. Are babies stupid? They're not stupid. They're ignorant. They don't know anything yet, but they're very, very, very smart. How is it that they're so capable of learning? Well, the myth of anamnesis gives us an answer to that. Humans are made to learn. That's the kind of beings we are. We're the kind of beings who are made to learn meanings and put together meanings. Why? Well, because when a baby is learning something, or when we're learning something, we're not learning it for the first time. We already know it. Our omniscient spirit is still in us, but our bodily nature suppresses it. Plato somewhere says that the body is the prison house of the soul, and this is what he means, that the body, that matter, suppresses spirit or intellect. And so when we're learning something, we're actually just being reminded, anamnesis. We're being reminded of what we already knew. Maybe that's what Needleman's talking about here. We're going to look in this section at some different definitions of philosophy. The ones you see in quotes here are all from your textbook Invitation to Philosophy. And we'll pick them apart a little bit as, first off, a way of understanding philosophy, but also a way of practicing analysis. So here's wisdom. Philosophy is love of wisdom. Where does that come from? Well, philos, it's the same as the prefix on the name Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. So philos is love. On the end of the word philosophy, S-O-P-H-Y, that comes from sophos. And this is sophos. This is Sophia, wisdom. I've given you a Buddhist image, or two Buddhist images and two Christian images, and I'm sure we could find many more. Interestingly, wisdom in all of these cases is depicted as female, which probably tells us something. Depicted as an angel in the, I think in the Buddhist image, depicted with a sword in one hand, which I think is suggestive. By the way, in the icon where you have Sophia is the tall woman, and you have the three shorter women, those are the supernatural virtues, faith, hope, and love. So philosophy is love of wisdom, the philos of sophos. But what is wisdom? Wisdom is an interesting virtue. If you think about it, it's first off a very rare virtue. Think about the number of people you might know in your life who you would consider wise. Ask yourself, would you consider yourself wise? If somebody asked you if you were wise, would you say, well, yeah? Isn't it interesting that most of us would not claim wisdom? Now, if I asked you if you're honest, you would say yes, or at least that you try to be. But with wisdom, we're a little bit more circumspect. We, on the one hand, it would seem very egotistical to consider ourselves wise. So what is it about wisdom that makes it such a virtue, but makes it one about which we, wind up being very humble? Some people say that wisdom has to do with, it comes with age. But on the other hand, there are many old people who are fools, who don't know anything. Obviously, there's knowledge involved, but it's not just knowledge, because there are a lot of very educated people who aren't wise. It might have to do with practical knowledge, with know-how, the application of knowledge. It might have to do with other spiritual qualities. Think about it. Think about how you would define wisdom and where you have found examples of wisdom in your life. So the first definition of philosophy is that it's a rigorous attempt to understand. Rigor means strictness. And every science, all of the different sciences or intellectual disciplines have different ways of establishing rigor or strictness. They have different methods. They expect different outcomes. You don't use the same method, and you don't get the same kind of outcomes in psychology as you do in astrophysics. But aren't they both sciences? Well, this is an ongoing debate in the university and in intellectual culture both. What is a science? What should be considered a science? What shouldn't be considered a science? Most of the social sciences and a good number of other departments in the university today were not considered sciences and really were thought not to belong in the university for many, many years. And they had to prove that they had some kind of system. In other words, some kind of method that resulted in a given outcome. On the other hand, we might ask the question, why is strictness of reasoning important? Why do we have to focus on method and theory so much if existence itself is chaotic? Well, first off, we don't know that existence is ultimately chaotic. One of the basic premises of science, philosophy, and religion is that the universe is meaningful. If the universe isn't meaningful, then we just don't do these things. So the Greeks would have said that there is a pattern or meaning to reality. This is the logos, Logos. It's also, by the way, the name of the ship that Neo pilots to the machine city, but we'll get to that later. The logos is an ancient Greek word. It's the most important philosophical word coming from ancient Greece. It can just mean word, W-O-R-D, like the words coming out of my mouth or the words on a piece of paper. But it also means concept. It can mean L-O-G-Y as a suffix on the end of words, signifies the study of. So, for example, biology is the study of or the science of the bios, of life. Logos can mean the pattern, the sort of hidden pattern that gives meaning to reality. And the Greeks, generally speaking, thought that there was a logos to reality that gave it meaning. And there is a logos to the human mind, and it's the same logos. So that when we know something truthfully, when we know the truth, we are tapping into the logos. It's almost like putting an electrical plug in a wall socket. You're going to get current, right? Because our mind is plugging into reality. That's the logos. If that is the case, then proper thinking that leads to truth is the same as the logos of reality itself. That's what the Greeks thought. But maybe it's more, maybe this perception of the logos is something like understanding, not just the conclusion of a logical analysis, but a kind of insight, an enlightenment experience, like getting out of the cave. Maybe it's a eureka experience like Archimedes had when he sat down in the bath and it was filled up too much, and he figured out the principle of the displacement of solids. Archimedes had a problem. He had a king who wanted to know whether this crown he'd been given was authentic gold or fake gold, and Archimedes didn't know how to figure it out until he sat down and he figured out the principle of displacement. Then he was able to weigh using water, vats of water. He was able to put the crown in and weigh it and figure out that the crown was or was not authentic. And when he realized that he had figured out the solution to his problem, he jumped up out of the bath and reportedly ran down the street without getting dressed first, yelling "Eureka," which means "I found it." Maybe it's that kind of moment. I mean, I think we've all had those moments of insight where something we've been struggling with for a long time suddenly makes sense. Maybe that's what this, but the problem is this definition applies to way too many things. It's too vague. A rigorous attempt to understand, well, so is physics. So what makes physics different than philosophy? Let's look at a different definition. A persistent and organized attempt to see life steadily and see it whole. Persistence is important, of course. If you're going to, like that bestseller book, Outliers, said, if you're going to become an expert at something, you're going to have to put the time in. In that book, it was claimed that 10,000 hours seems to be the watershed. You put in 10,000 hours and you suddenly master something, if you have the, disposition to become a master of it, at least. I don't know if that claim is accurate or all that helpful, but certainly to do philosophy well, like to do anything else well, is going to require persistence. But it needs to be organized persistence. The Greek word for organized is teleological. Telos, T-E-L-O-S, means goal. So a teleological system is a system that has a goal, that looks for or studies the goal. Most philosophies are teleological. You could say Plato's cave allegory is teleological, I suppose, because the goal is to get out into the sun and know the nature of the truth. Well, if we want to get good at philosophy, or whatever other thing we want to get good at, as Plato and Aristotle both say, we're going to be much more successful at achieving whatever it is we set out to do if we know what the destination is. Of course, we may not know it perfectly, but at least we have a direction that we can go in. To see life steadily, again, to look at it consistently, to be willing to look at things that don't necessarily agree with our own presuppositions, to challenge our own presuppositions. But all of this raises the question, is it possible to see life whole, W-H-O-L-E? Is it, what kind of vision would this be? It always makes me think of the last Indiana Jones movie. At the end of the movie, the Nazi gal who's chasing Indiana Jones all over the place finally gets her wish to come before the aliens, and she wants to know everything. She wants them to put, to let her see directly all of their knowledge. And when they do, of course, it explodes her brain, or, quite a graphic scene. But hopefully it won't be that kind of vision. But whether it's even possible to see life steadily and see it whole, well, we'll talk more about that when we read an article by Pierre Hadot and study Hellenistic philosophy a little bit later. Of course, one thing that philosophy is an area of study. It's a discipline. It's a department within the university. It is a science, a way of knowledge. This is the famous painting, The School of Athens. You see in the middle Plato and Aristotle. You see sprawled on the steps, half naked, the cynic Diogenes. If you go online and Google this painting, The School of Athens, you can find out who some of the rest of these folks are as well, if you care. But yeah, I mean, this raises the question, where does philosophy fit in the grand scheme of the university? Well, first off, certainly there is a major and a minor in philosophy. If you major in philosophy, of course, the idea would be that you're going to go on to do philosophy. What would that mean? Are there jobs in philosophy? And the short answer is no, there are no jobs in philosophy other than teaching philosophy. There are jobs where philosophy can support other things, which is why I generally don't recommend a philosophy major, but I do highly recommend a philosophy minor. Statistics have said again and again and again that employers like to see that philosophy minor in somebody's resume, because it means that they are independent thinkers and capable of critical thought and that kind of thing. I don't know whether that's true. If you are thinking about a philosophy major, please feel free to email me or call, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I will not get into it very much now, except to say that my general response would be, if you can do anything else that makes money, you probably should, because philosophy, really the only reason to do philosophy is that you're a philosopher. You have to do philosophy. It's what you do. And you're not going to make much of a living at it nowadays, I'm afraid to say. All right, another definition, an individual's general approach to life. Well, again, this is pretty vague. I mean, the great pragmatist philosopher William James said that everybody has a philosophy. I always thought that was absurd, but what he means is that everybody has a philosophy in the sense of a system of ideas. You don't just have random ideas collected in your mind that you believe in. No, nor do you have necessarily well worked out, carefully analyzed ideas in your head that that are your belief system. Rather, what most of us have is a collection of better and worse analyzed sort of presuppositions, and when we encounter a new idea, if it fits with our presuppositions, we take it on board, and if it doesn't, we tend to marginalize it, repress it, or otherwise ignore it. But the reason that we do that is that our minds are systematic. Even when we don't intend to be, we will not knowingly take on board an idea that contradicts our basic presuppositions. We will not knowingly take on board an idea that conflicts with our presuppositions. So even though we haven't carefully analyzed all of our ideas, there is a basic systematicity to our thoughts, and that's actually one of the things that keeps keeps the prisoners imprisoned in the cave, which is that their interpretations seem to work, and they're mostly effective. And whenever challenged, our minds find a way of dealing with that challenge and reestablishing our presuppositions. So I don't know if you want to call that a philosophy. It's more of an informal and naive systematization of our thoughts. I mean, a highly systematized, organized way of thinking would be Descartes' methodological doubt that I've already mentioned. We'll talk more about later. What keeps the prisoners imprisoned in the cave, after all? It is their presuppositions, in a way. More than that, it is the way that everything that appears through their senses reaffirms what they already believe. So the two things that keeps the prisoners imprisoned are appearances. Now, the appearances are not pure illusion. Now, we have firelight, which represents illusion, and we have sunlight that also comes into the cave that represents truth. The images on the wall of the cave represent what shows up through our senses, sensory perception. Those appearances are a mixture of illusion and truth. The problem is not that they're pure illusion. The problem is that what shows up to our senses is a mixture of illusion and truth, and we don't know how to distinguish between illusion and truth until we get out of the cave and see what the truth is. On the basis of those appearances, we have formed opinions. And those opinions have been reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed by our society, our families, our teachers, and other things. And therefore, we are most likely to just accept the general viewpoint, the general zeitgeist, the general spirit of the times, the general outlook that we grew up with. And therefore, to challenge those things is very difficult for us. And it must be said, can be dangerous, because if you challenge the prevailing mores, if you challenge the prevailing values of your society, like Socrates did, you could wind up like Socrates, that is, executed by the state for subversion. Another way of understanding philosophy is to say that the main job of philosophy is to analyze the presuppositions of science. That is, when a scientist is being a scientist, they're not being philosophers. They basically are naively accepting that what they perceive is actually there in the way that they perceive it. When an astronomer looks at the heavens through a telescope, they don't question whether they're not being epistemologists. They're not looking at the nature of knowledge. They're looking at the nature of stars. And what they see is what is there, according to that science. Well, Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, said that this is naive realism. And the job of philosophy is to give a more certain basis to the sciences. Since scientists can't be both scientists and philosophers at the same time, the job of philosophers is to provide a foundation for the sciences. This is also true of logical positivism, and A.J. Ayer is one of the founders of logical positivism. Logical positivism goes a step further and says that really what philosophy is analysis of language, because first off, we can't know whether reality is what reality appears as. What we can do, though, is we can analyze our language and make our language more precise in a scientific way. And we'll talk more about logical positivism later on in a semester, too. The last definition we'll consider, and we'll pick it apart a little bit. Philosophy is an activity undertaken by human beings who are deeply concerned about who they are and what everything means, and a philosopher is a person who perceives in some measure the way in which the various experiences and awarenesses of existence form a pattern of meaning. Let's break it down. What do philosophers do? Well, here's a short list. I already talked about asceticism. Now, there are philosophers who do analysis primarily, and they don't tend to view philosophy as a way of life. But when you get right down to it, if you do philosophy as analysis, then analysis is in some sense your way of life. Well, at any rate, the image is of the three wise men from the Christian New Testament who were magi. They were wise men. They were astronomers. at least traditionally speaking. And by the way, most philosophers have been religious. Most philosophers have been scientists. Okay, I hope this hurts your eyes. I wanted to have an image that was a pattern, right? Because they say that the philosopher perceives the way the various experiences and awarenesses of existence form a pattern of meaning. We're looking for pattern. The word for pattern really is logos. Things show up to us as meaningful, not meaningless. Things hang together. Ideas hang together. There are connections between ideas, and the connections between our ideas represent connections in reality in some way. And that's what one of the main things we'll be looking at is how that works, right? Okay, couple of helpful things. Hoehner and Hunt's 2 helpful rubrics for studying philosophy. So I hope you enjoy the pun there. Here is the pie chart. 3 major divisions of philosophy. I've already mentioned 2 of the 3. Metaphysics is the study of the most general concepts, being especially being the most broad, because if it can be thought, it has to have existence in some form. So if it can be thought, it exists. If it exists, it could be thought. That's the basic principle of metaphysics. But metaphysics also studies other big concepts like Plato's forms, justice with a capital J, the good with a capital G, the beauty with a capital B. Very broad, non-physical concepts, abstract concepts, if you will. Epistemology is the study of the episteme, of knowledge. So we will have a section in the course called Models of Knowing. That's how I refer to epistemology. Axiology is the study of value. Now there are 3 areas of axiology. Here we have, and I'll talk about epistemology in a minute as well. But axiology, down at on the lower bullet point there, there are 3 types of study of value. Ethics studies, you can think of this as kind of weighing things. Axiology, we weigh the value of different things. In ethics, we weigh the value of right and wrong, good and bad, or good and evil. Aesthetics, we weigh beauty and ugliness. In political theory, we weigh justice and injustice, right and wrong. So axiology covers all those 3 fields. Now, ontology is a word that means study of being. So ontology is a slightly narrower term than metaphysics. I would say ontology is a part of metaphysics. But those 2 terms are often used differently, so you have to look at context with them. We don't need to look at the different types of epistemology that I have listed right now. You don't need to know this or memorize this or anything. This is just a helpful listing of the divisions of philosophy. One thing you'll notice is there are some divisions here, but when we get over to the modern period, this is not even anywhere near a complete list of all the divisions in philosophy. I mean, now I even took a class at DU that was called Postmodernism. So we're still inventing new divisions in philosophy and new types of philosophy. The continuum is the other thing that your textbook gives you. Generally speaking, the chapters are all arranged in the same way. So, for example, there's a chapter on freedom and determinism. So the first thing that Hoehner and Hunt will do is they'll talk about pure freedom. Now, the concept of pure freedom is a hard one to defend because we're not absolutely free. After all, if we were absolutely free, we'd float off into space. We wouldn't be determined by gravity. So that's a very difficult position, but they'll give the arguments for it and then the arguments against it. Then they'll give the arguments for determinism and the arguments against determinism. Then, once they've established the 2 extreme positions, they start to talk about the more intermediate positions. And that's what the continuum represents. And they'll present each position, and then they'll present the arguments against it. So you very much have a dialectical process through each one of these chapters. Last thing, the traditional antinomies, we'll get more into this later in analyzing them, but this is one of the fundamental ways in which human beings organize reality, one of the fundamental meanings or patterns that we find in reality. Perhaps it's because we have a quote-unquote bicameral brain, that is 2 sides of the mind. Whatever the reason, Splitting things up into opposites, dualisms, binaries is one of the most fundamental ways for human beings to organize reality. And this is just a short list, and we'll see some of the implications of this list in later lectures, but that should do it for now. Have a good day.